Hello, everyone. In the past year, our country and the world have been rocked by a global pandemic, a reckoning related to racial justice and equity, and a divisive presidential election here in the United States. These events further exposed existing disparities and inequities in access to quality education and culturally responsive curricula, as well as the profound impact of police brutality and systemic racism on the lives of Black, Indigenous, and other children of color. For us at Committee for Children, it brought into focus an important question. How can we create a safe, peaceful, and more just world for every child, especially those most marginalized? A world where every child has access to an education that is effective for and representative of diverse identities and cultures. At Committee for Children, our vision and our mission are at the heart of everything we do. But we cannot truly achieve our aspirations without centering our work in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. We've committed ourselves to continuous learning and improvement. We plan to continue responding to the needs of children, educators, families, and the communities we serve, and those we hope to serve. And we will amplify and elevate the voices that must be heard. Today, we invite you to join us on this learning journey. Our Vice President of Education, Research, and Impact, Dr. Tia Kim, recently spoke with a group of students, educators, and experts to better understand the needs of schools and districts in supporting the children in their communities. Let's hear what they have to say.
Thank you, Andrea, and welcome everyone to today's panel discussion on diversity, equity, and inclusion in education. My name is Tia Kim. As Andrea mentioned, Committee for Children is dedicated to continuous learning and improving our social-emotional learning resources to be more impactful and representative of the diverse student populations we serve. We approach everything we do from a research-based standpoint, often connecting and consulting with many educators and experts to ensure our offerings are meeting those needs. Today, we're here to learn more about how the pandemic and social issues have affected students and how educators can work to create more inclusive spaces for children. I'm really excited to be joined by our educator and student guests today. Let's have them introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Caden Coleman, and I'm 13 years old, and I go to RVLA, Rainier Valley Leadership Academy.
My name is Leah Sadoon. I'm a 7th grader at Meridian Middle School, and I'm really excited to be on this panel because social justice is a really big passion of mine.
I'm Ashley Campbell. I'm outside of Dallas, Texas, in Richardson, Texas, and I'm the Social and Emotional Learning Program Specialist for RISD. And so we've had some SEL initiatives with Committee for Children with our curriculum, and so we really wanted to prioritize the role and have a program specialist. So this is actually my first year officially as the program specialist for SEL.
Hello, my name is Jason LaFontaine, and I am an enrolled member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa from Belcourt, North Dakota. I'm coming to you today from my home, which is on the ancestral lands of the Puyallup Tribe of Indians. For the past 15 years, I've been the manager of the Puget Sound Educational Service District Native American Education Program, and we serve over 500 students with Native American heritage in 4 school districts near the Tacoma, Washington area. And one of the reasons I do this work is because I get to work with students who were a lot like me. They remind me of me when I was their age. You know, a student who had Native heritage but was kind of just engrossed in a giant school district, kind of invisible. My heritage was invisible to teachers, and I was basically taught almost nothing about Native American history, and certainly nothing about contemporary history. So. And the agency I work for, the Puget Sound ESD, we're one of 9 regional service districts in the state of Washington, and our agency strives to be an anti-racist, multicultural organization. And as part of that work, I work with the school district personnel, which is teachers, counselors, district administrators, to help raise awareness to the Native American population and how they can best support them in the schools. So, pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me today.
I'm Madeline Mason. I'm a 10-year educator, 10th year in education, not 10-year. I was a middle school teacher for 8 years. I'm middle school all the way. I'm one of those odd people. I adore middle schoolers and couldn't imagine working with any other age group. So now I serve, I taught in the classroom for 8 years, and now I serve as a social emotional learning instructional coach for 3 middle schools in Indianapolis, Indiana. I also serve as a DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion facilitator. I like to say that as a white woman, I am constantly earning the right to lead DEI spaces, and that's part of my journey. I lead an organization, co-lead an organization called Mindful Equity with my wonderful partner, Mariah, who also works here with me in Indianapolis. We focus on, our passion is wellness, healing, liberation work, all through a racial justice lens. We work together on bringing learning experiences to educators primarily. Actually, I'm also a student still. I'm pursuing my PhD in urban education studies with a focus on critical whiteness studies and dismantling white supremacy culture and how it shows up in oppressive ways that do not conduce or do not breed well environments for all people, with a focus on students and teachers.
So I'm really excited to have this dialogue, and so let's get started. And so first, I'll pose the first question to you, Ashley, and then we'll just go around with the same question. So the first question is, this past year has been unbelievably traumatic on everyone, but especially our children. So not only have they had to be dealing with the pandemic, but also our Black, Indigenous, and other children of color have particularly had to deal with the racial reckoning from police brutality. There's been uptick of crimes against the Asian American Pacific Islander community, and of course, also at times being disproportionately affected by the effects of the pandemic. So Ashley, in your work in dealing with students, how does racism and the trauma from that have you seen affected students' ability to learn?
I think just not having that trauma recognized always, and it doesn't necessarily have to be said out loud, but just for teachers and other school staff to be not only cognizant of what's going on in the world for our students of color, but just to be able to acknowledge that there is trauma. I think that sometimes that gets overlooked. And a lot of these things they're not things that are in the control of our students or their families. These are things that are happening to them, whether it's witnessing a lot of the Asian hate and, police brutality, those kind of things, witnessing that, those are things that are out of their control. And so I think sometimes just not being aware of that really does affect the learning that's going to take place. And then also not having that awareness can bring more trauma to the students. We have that school-based trauma as well. So I think by not having those conversations with kids and being a support system for them, it makes it harder for them to really put their all into learning and even knowing where to start with learning when you're trying to process what's happening to people who look like you, people in your families. That's a really difficult thing for students who are bringing that to school each day.
Great. What about you, Jason? What about in the work that you do and the students that you interact with? How do you see racism, affecting their ability to learn or be present in the classroom?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think what happens, especially speaking as a Native American, but not speaking for all Native Americans, I think the trauma and the racism that has been built in our systems, the mistrust that has been there between Native people and educators, and the barriers that creates it's a long, complex history with Native people going as far back as the late 1800s with boarding school experiences. And that effect, even though it was 120, 140 years ago, the ripple effect that has had on every generation of Native people can't be overlooked. And if you look at the graduation rates, you look at test scores, you look at the suicide rates, unfortunately, Native people are always on the worst end of that data. Like I said, a minute ago, the boarding schools, they took away our traditional languages and our culture, our religious freedom, and it created this loop that continues today. So that many of our families have this kind of social, emotional, and cultural well-being that is not being attended to in the classroom, and it's a cycle that's been hard to break. And lots of educators, non-educators, and many Native educators have spent decades trying to figure out how to break that cycle. The one issue today, I think what our students see is they don't see themselves. When they go into the school, they do not see Native front office staff. They never see Native educators, Native teachers in the classroom, Native administrators. There's not any Native people that they see as role models. Even there's a recent study that was done that said that 87% of the state level history standards in the United States failed to cover Native American history after basically 1890, after the Indian Wars, which means most students in the United States have no idea that Native people still exist today and that we have a culture that is thriving here. And there's also a lot of information out there kind of about kind of the biological and neurological science that links experiences of historical trauma triggering the fight and flight or freeze mechanism within a child's brain today. And a lot of that work is kind of developing. I don't know a whole lot about that, but have heard a few speakers talk about that. And so that's kind of our big issue, is just our students not seeing themselves and feeling wanted or feeling appreciated and connected with their school community. I like to say they almost have to leave their culture at the door when they walk through that front door to the school. And that's something we never want to see. So that's why I love the work that our program does, my staff and I, and my colleagues in other school districts in the region, because the state of Washington has a really vibrant Native American community, all up and down Western Washington and some in Eastern Washington, of course. Just being able to keep that culture alive and keep our traditions alive. And we even have some language programs happening around the region to kind of get that revived too. So
great. And Madeline, have you seen the racism and the trauma that comes from that sort of reflected in the student populations that you work with?
Well, thanks for the two of you that have already shared just great answers. But I will add on to something that Jason touched on, just about the brain and the body, and that like physiological impact. And I think that's something that we're just not talking enough about right now. And it's definitely new-ish to the field in a scientific way. But, thinking of racism and trauma as actually having impacts on the brain and the body, that keep students from being able to access learning and the curriculum, and that is further compounded by like what Jason shared, students not seeing themselves in the curriculum, that does actually compound that impact. And I don't think that educators that we are understanding that, to our credit. I don't think that we've fully been like taught that, or that is like fully been embedded into our training. So understanding that it's not just an emotion or social response, but it is actually like a brain and a body physiological response that is causing trauma in our students. I would also add just, these are adult issues, not child issues. These are systemic issues that leaders, that gatekeepers, we have a responsibility to minimize and eliminate the impact that racism and trauma have on our students' ability to learn. Oftentimes, mistake that I see made is focusing solely on the child and what we, need to fix or remedy in the child. And if we're not looking at the systems, the culture, doing that work at the adult level, then we're just putting Band-Aids on it and not really getting at the root of how racism and trauma are impacting our students' lived experiences in school. And the last thing that I'll say is that, in this work, we have to embrace multiple truths, and knowing that yes, the harms of racism and trauma are very real on our students, but it's also important that we don't see our students solely as their trauma, because that can further compound that impact. We're finding joy, we're celebrating, we're seeing our students through an asset-based lens and really acknowledging the brilliance and the strengths that they bring to the world, and not getting stuck in a place of trauma and oppression, which of course impacts our students' ability to learn, but also their long-term trajectory.
So how do you think the trauma of racism has affected your ability to learn, or has it affected your ability to learn at all?
It's been really difficult to build relationships because, we aren't seeing each other in person. And I mean, that goes for building relationships with teachers and students. I've been a 7th grader for like almost a year, and I don't feel like I know most of my classmates. It's also harder to feel confident about like your schoolwork when the teacher isn't there in person to help you. It can also be frustrating and difficult when you message a teacher, email a teacher for a question, and they don't message you back, because it can be kind of stressful on the student's end, especially when it's about grades, or if the end of the quarter or the end of the semester is coming up. So that can be a bit difficult. And as for the racial issues, I don't feel like they have negatively affected my ability to learn. I actually feel like it's brought us closer together, as, some of my classmates and we've had like similar experiences and opinions surrounding race and discrimination. And I also feel more empowered, actually, because I have called several people out because they've made like racist, sexist, or homophobic remarks. And so I've actually called them out. And I think that everything that's been going on has made me more empowered, and I felt more confident to do that.
Yeah, it did affect my learning for a long period. And when everything that was going on, especially with the George Floyd things, and like a little before that last year, I was at a different school, so I wasn't at the school I'm at now. And my school that I was at, they didn't handle it very well. It was like they kind of just ignored it, and it was really frustrating because it was videotaped and everybody knew about it. Everybody knew what happened, and they decided to kind of not really talk about it very much. There was not really a space where you could express your feelings, and I feel like some other schools may have also possibly done that. And I feel like there needs to also be a time where schools can talk about those certain things and be able to let kids explain how they feel about that. There are certain things that I would have to worry about that a lot of white kids wouldn't necessarily have to worry about at all. Even when I was younger and we got pulled over when I was younger, my dad was like, do not make any sudden movements or anything like that, because it could lead to a very bad situation. At that time, I started to kind of grasp and figure out what was going on, but I couldn't really figure it out. And a lot of times when you're black or brown, you have to learn these things early on, because if you don't learn them when you eventually become a teenager or adult, in those situations, it can lead to some things that are very bad.
So, we've heard a lot from teachers and educators that are deeply invested in diversity, equity, and inclusion work, especially now, currently with everything that's going on. But we're hearing from many of them, and I'm sure many of you hear this too, that they don't really know where to start, or they want to make sure that they're not doing anything wrong or doing more harm than good. So what should educators be mindful of when they're starting this type of work, be it anti-racism work or anti-bias work? And if you could give them one piece of advice, what would it be? So why don't we start with you, Jason, for this question?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing I would say is, don't plan on solving this complex issue or unwinding years of kind of this white dominant thinking by just taking, one training or doing a year of monthly meetings, or maybe doing a book club where everybody's reading White Fragility, and talking about it. This is a long journey that you're undertaking. So don't plan on solving the whole issue in 1 year. There's going to be lots of starts and stops. There's going to be some fallbacks, some step backs. You may come across some of your own biases that you didn't know you had that you're going to feel uncomfortable with. And that's okay that you have to sit in your own discomfort sometimes, because that's kind of how we're going to move forward. For example, usually every year in one of the 4 districts that I serve, one of our well-intended educators has a misstep. They use inappropriate curriculum, or they find that one year we had a drama teacher create a play, and they had a native character, and of course for some reason they had that native character speak in like 1950s Hollywood native speak, and unfortunately I don't ever hear about this till after the fact, when the kids have already been affected by it. So it's just, I know that these districts mean well, but still there's a lot of work to do. So my one piece of advice would be really to just try to listen to others when they talk about their experiences, especially people of color. Don't try and solve or explain their experiences away. Just listen and remember that we all have our own biases in our life experiences. But the fact that they want to get into the work and start doing that deep dive, that's encouraging. So.
Great. How about you, Madeline? What would be your one piece of advice for educators as they start this journey in this work?
We have to play the long game. We have to stop looking for quick fixes, strategies, checklists, tell me what to do. We have to do deep work. And along with that comes talking about whiteness, talking about white supremacy culture and how it shows up in oppressive ways. And to Jason's point, not just via a book club. And we have to do so simultaneously in a way that decenters whiteness, as contradictory as that may sound, but provides healing and validating spaces for BIPOC in this work. That's just a huge critique of DEI work and primarily white spaces, which most of our schools are. So we have to understand this is complex and there are no simple solutions to complex issues, and we have to dive deep and be willing to stick it through the shame, the guilt, the fear, the emotions. I say in some of my work that talking about oppression is not oppression. Oppression is oppression. So distinguishing those and staying in the work and doing that deep work and that work that people oftentimes want to push away because it's too hard. And to my point earlier, providing spaces for people to process the emotions and the healing that need to come with that.
Great. How about you, Ashley? What would be your advice?
I mean, just to kind of echo what both Jason and Madeline said, being in it for the long haul and really starting with that self-awareness. I think a lot of times we don't want to confront our own biases. And if we are really committed to doing that, then we have to look at, what biases do I hold about the students that I serve, the staff that I work with. And I've just been on a lot of different committees lately. I know that the diversity and equity and inclusion trend is really hot right now. But I've been in a lot of spaces where the white voices were still the center. And so even when we think about the white fragility book, could we find a book that's written by somebody of color? Could we have somebody come in and, you're right, just listening to what they have to say and believing what they have to say. I think, those are important for us to do with other educators who may or may not look like us, so that we can do that with our students as well, because a lot of times their voices aren't centered, and that's really who we should be serving as our students. So if we're going to, really have a student-centered focus, then we have to be able to take ourselves out and look at our biases, no matter what background we come from, and then look at how we can dismantle that white supremacy. And that starts with decentering white voices too.
What advice would you give school leaders or teachers on how to approach this work and implement anti-racist policies and programs and create a really inclusive classroom environment to help to be responsive to Black, Indigenous, and other students of colors? Like, what would your advice be to them?
I would definitely say check in with the community and ask them about their experiences. Maybe have some of them come in and talk about their experiences so the kids, they know that there's someone that looks like them that can actually be able to tell their experience. But the other part, you need to check in with the community, because those are the people that are really suffering from it a lot of times, suffering from racism. And if you don't, then it can really take a toll on your school. So I would also say that don't be afraid to talk about racism in schools, because I know a lot of schools, they don't like to talk about it and like to try to avoid it. And avoiding it's not the right thing to do. And also try to include history of racism and things like that in your curriculum.
First off, I feel like other groups of minorities should be talked about more and included more. Like, for example, mental health. I've had classmates before that have mental health issues, and so they act in a certain way, but the other students don't know that they have a mental health issue, and that mental health issue can cause you to act in that way or say something, and so they view that student as mean or disrespectful. So teachers should educate students more about diversity, and, you know, everybody is different and thinks differently. There's also, you know, different religions. I've had people look at me and give me like a bad look because I wear a hijab. I know some other people in other religions, because of their clothes, have faced discrimination. There are other unseen differences that we don't talk about as much. There's sexual orientation, there's culture. Personally, for sexual orientation, I have several classmates that I knew them once as one gender and they have transitioned to another, but I'm not sure how to politely say that. So I mean well, I'm not sure how to politely talk about it. And so just teachers providing more education to students and including other groups of minorities is really helpful. I also feel like the school should set strict policies and regulations and clearly communicate to students and hold students accountable for any sort of racist or derogatory comment towards a minority group or a certain minority. There is a lot of talk about bullying at school. I don't feel like there's enough talk about discrimination and how that's not okay. So that's another thought that I had. And sometimes when we watch instructional videos about, I don't know, how to do like a math problem or something, either students or adults in that video talking to the audience, there isn't a ton of diversity. It's normally a white person, and they don't show people in different cultural clothing. It's really not diverse. So that kind of shows students that maybe they aren't seen as much. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, that's something else that I thought of. I also feel like we should learn more about social justice during school, like formally, like during school in classes. We've all learned about Martin Luther King at school, Harriet Tubman. I mean, but that's about all. That's like all I remember. And we don't dive deep into what they really did. And we learn a lot about history. And that's like American history, which really helps because you don't want to repeat history. But I feel like we should learn more about people like Ruby Bridges and Bert Williams, Dolores Huerta, Maya Angelou, people like those, because it applies more to today and what we're facing today. We could also have a social justice campaign that's year-round, that's led by students, where students teach other students about social justice and have team-building exercises surrounding social justice.
Just because I know, different folks do different types of trainings or read different resources, do any of you have any suggestions on something that you've read recently or a training that you've attended that you felt was really effective or did a really nice job and
and talking about some of these issues. I was just wondering, so just thought I'd open it up to any of you.
I went to something over the summer, and it was Bettina Love and Dina Simmons, who are really big there, and just hearing, and I know some of you may have just heard about Dina Simmons just recently kind of branching out and started Liberated SEL. And so, again, that was really refreshing to be part of that dialogue. It was really just listening to them talk about, different issues and students. So that was a really good one that I attended over the summer.
I couldn't speak highly enough of the Courageous Conversations About Race 9-week module course. You can Google it, public consulting group, similar to Glenn Singleton's organization, but just as far as giving educators, people really, like this is life work, as many of you know, tools for having courageous conversations about that thing we never want to talk about, which is racial equity and whiteness and white supremacy. And then I would also add, there's lots of different trainings out there, but one thing that's been really impactful in our district is doing race-based affinity spaces, to provide those spaces for people to dive into the work that needs to be done in separate racial spaces, but then also we come together. We follow the work of Ruth King in our approach to affinity spaces, so those would be two things.
Great. And then Jason, I heard you wanted to add something too.
Our agency has our own, as we strive to become an anti-racist, multicultural organization, our equity and diversity, we have a whole department and a director who oversees it. We have monthly manager anti-racism trainings and also monthly trainings for all staff to take part in. So some of the people that we've had in is Theda Newbreast is a Native American woman from, I believe she's from Montana. I've sat in on a couple of her trainings over the years. Except, so I kind of I don't have any names of specific programming. It's just some people that have come in and spoken. And Theda Newbreast, Sol Diaz, I believe her name is. She's out here in Seattle. And just a person here at our agency that has created a whole system for us to learn from. We also have kind of a unique system that we do. We come together as people of color and our white employees, and then that's for the first hour where we learn together, and then the second hour we separate out, and so the white employees have their space to talk things through, and the people of color employees have their space to talk through things. So, which is, I think, a unique approach.
Thank you so much for all the suggestions. I think it's just nice to hear from other educators what they've found to be really helpful. So actually, you bring up Dina Simmons' work, and I think the next question is a good segue to the next question, bring up her work. So recently, there has been criticism of social-emotional learning, and particularly how it may not support equity work. So what is some of the criticisms that you all may have heard, and what are your thoughts on how we can approach SEL or social-emotional learning work to address some of these critiques? And I'll start with you, Madeline, this time.
Well, that's the first thing I thought of when I read this question is Dina Simmons' critique of, she calls it white supremacy with a hug. And I think what she's alluding to is this idea of like focus, control, assimilation, which as any curriculum and an approach in our classrooms and schools can be used as a weapon to control, to suppress, if not done through the right lens. So truly, SEL at its roots, and in my opinion and experience, is not meant to do that. But if we have unaware, teachers, educators who are lacking the cultural competence, the DEI lens, the anti-racist focus, it can appear that way when we have, 90% of our teaching force as white, saying this is the right way to be, and this is the only way to be. And that is also a characteristic of white dominant culture, is the binary thinking. So we have to get out of the binary thinking in order to create a space where students can explore explore and put their own voice into social emotional learning. To me, the root of social emotional learning is joy and healthy identity development, and students being able to explore and to make mistakes and just find, to your plug, Ashley, with Bettina Love, the spaces where they feel that they matter and they're joyful classrooms. And that's what SEL should support our students in doing. So if we focus more on that, which then brings us to being in relationship with our students. So one of the things that I talked about, I worked on a committee with the IDOE, the Indiana Department of Education, to revamp our standards. One of the central conversations that we had is about this idea of wellness and how ableist the current definition was, how exclusionary the current definition was, how imposing it was on the right way to be well. And so we decided, let's nix it altogether. Let's write some lesson plans where teachers actually empower students or work with students to define, what does wellness look like for you? And I think that we could do that with a lot of things in education. What does success look like to you? So not this we're starting to break that down in education, this teacher front of the room lecture, I don't know, the Charlie Brown, talking at students. We're really starting to break that down. And I think that's key in our SEL work, is we're working together. We're navigating through things together. There's no absolute right one single binary way to be, but we're really creating this collective space of learning and joy and empowerment where students have a voice and a say.
Great. I really love and support your idea of having more student voice into what they're learning. It's something I've been thinking a lot about as I've been reading a lot of the criticisms around SEL, is really thinking about who the true stakeholders who the true stakeholders are, and who are we really trying to create curriculum and lessons for. So that really resonates with me. And I know that's something that we've been thinking a lot about too in our work here at Committee for Children. So Ashley, do you have anything else to add in terms of what you've heard about recent criticisms around SEL, and some suggestions or recommendations on how SEL can really support equity work as well?
Yeah, I think that white supremacy with a hug that Madeline mentioned is kind of the idea. And I think, in a lot of spaces, SEL was promoted as this is how you can get kids to comply. This is going to be your behavior management program. This is going to get kids' scores to go up. So we were looking at all the things that to me really don't matter as far as how we're going to educate students. So if you take that compliance and management out of there and look at how can we teach kids to be upstanders? How can we teach kids to advocate for themselves? And so with that, student voice is really important, because we won't know how to, me as a almost 40-year-old woman is not going to know how to teach a child or a teenager how to advocate for themselves. They really need to bring that lens. And so I loved how Madeline shared that they're coming up with a definition of wellness. And so I think that's one thing that educators and stakeholders can do, is to really think about how can we center student voices? How can we look at that with that lens, instead of saying, how can we get kids to sit still in class so they can do their work and get good grades and all that stuff? Because that, that compact idea is not going to help them in the real world, where they'll need out of the box thinking. They'll need to get along with people who are, different than them. And so I think that's kind of the way to go with it, too. And I think having SEL to where they can have the skills to talk about those issues. I know in my district we have racial literacy lessons, which gives them they talk explicitly about race. And then we join that with our SEL, which gives them the tools, the responsible decision-making, the relationship skills, all those different things to have those tough conversations. So I think sometimes we don't give kids enough credit. They're ready for this talk. So, yeah.
Yeah, great points. Jason, how about you in this question?
Sure. Well, so I don't really work in SEL programming directly. So kind of in my circle of Native education and my specific job, I haven't really heard criticism of SEL and how it works with equity and diversity. But us as Native educators, my colleagues and I, we support kind of that indigenous ways of knowing for Native students, we think is a great way for them to learn outside of this kind of Western colonized education system. And I think it works well for adults as well. It's just a way that we don't just learn from our human interactions and relationships, but we learn by watching, by taking a step back and watching the plants grow and how are the animals reacting to what's out there. Kind of our indigenous ways are kind of steeped in that deep respect for nature and kind of relationships and the necessity, the kind of symbiotic relationship of the whole world around us in a circle. Everything's in that hoop, they call it, the circle of life kind of. We believe that our actions today will affect our future generations for the next 7 generations. So when we think about what we're doing, we need to think about, what are we doing today that's going to affect our relatives, our grandchildren, our great grandchildren, and what would our ancestors think of the work that we're doing today? So an elder friend of mine, he uses this analogy when working with Native students, and he says, rather than set the target and aim our arrow, metaphorically, of course, we need to shoot the arrow first, see where it lands, and then draw the bullseye around that. And then that's where our work begins, and that's where our work is at. So it's kind of a hard way, I think, of learning because we're kind of so set in this kind of colonized way of thinking for Western education. But I think that's kind of just the way, from my experience, watching our Native students go when we go on these academies for retreats for a couple of days, and they get away from their regular schooling and they're surrounded by Native elders and Native educators who are working with them, not talking at them, but working with them on projects. We find that our students really, really thrive in that relationship and in that kind of learning.
So what's one thing you would want everyone to know about how we could work together as a society to build a world that is more inclusive and belonging and, hopefully, anti-racist? What's your thoughts around that?
First, we're going to have to really start, I feel like we're going to have to really start teaching, especially younger kids at a young age, about racism, because when I was young, I wasn't taught about that very much. I had to go through a lot of racial experiences, and especially when I was younger, and I didn't really understand them until my mom had to start explaining them, and I had to start reading books on it. And I feel like you need to put those certain things in classrooms. Racism has been here for a very long time, and people think it has gotten better, but it has never gotten better. It stayed the same for a long time. It's happened in different ways. And I feel like, especially with the police shootings and things like that, I feel like you need to try to hire people from the community that understand where they're going into. Maybe at least let the officers live in places where they're going to have to be patrolling so they know what people in the community are feeling.
I think the main thing is patience and forgiveness. It takes time for people to learn how to be polite because, like I mentioned earlier, sometimes we don't know that we are saying something that isn't nice to somebody else. We don't always know that. So we need to be educated and we need to be taught that, this is something that you shouldn't say, and then this is something that's okay to say, because we don't always know. So we need to be forgiving and patient with everyone about it. And it takes time for people to learn things. So, yeah.
One thing I also want to think about for the future is even if racism starts to wither down and everybody starts to become aware, don't stop talking about it, because there's always going to be somebody that wants to keep it going. Sending a post out, it does spread awareness, but it's not, if you're actually going out there and doing the work, especially while doing it and being safe, because we do live in COVID, I would advise to at least try to go out and figure something out and talk with the organizations that are wanting to help break down racism and things like that. So That's something else I would say. Reach out to those organizations. Donate. Do what you can, because it's going to definitely help a lot.
So we've already reached our last question, which is, what do you see as the role of social emotional learning in supporting and really upholding diversity, equity, and inclusion work within education? So why don't we start again with you, Ashley, and your thoughts on this question?
I think it's really important to, I guess, start off dispelling any myths about SEL. And I think even kind of piggybacking off the last question that, the SEL is about, management and compliance, but it really should be about advocacy. And so I think in order to do that, in order to support kind of the diversity and equity work, it really needs to be rooted in a culturally responsive framework. And so Jason mentioned some examples of, ways of knowing and ways of learning that are not, traditionally held in our school culture. And so just being open to that. And I think those are kind of the first steps into really having SEL support those initiatives.
I definitely believe that the role of SEL in diversity and equity work is very important because it humanizes everyone's experiences. It gives people knowledge of other ways of thinking instead of just everybody having the same experience, sitting around a table, figuring out how to do things. You get other people in there who have other experiences, bring different ideas to the table, and hopefully can create something off of that. SEL gives educational leaders who often kind of live in that kind of that black and white world of data. It gives them an added lens to kind of see the work and support the systems that can hopefully better provide programs and better relationships and better curriculum for all of their students and working with their staff. I work in a few of our school districts' equity and diversity committees. I kind of come in and speak with them every now and then. And most of those equity and diversity committees are in predominantly white districts. So most of the staff or most of the people on the committee are white. And one thing they definitely appreciate is when somebody from a different ethnicity comes in and gives them a different perspective, because it's something that they rarely hear from. It's not something they're used to. They don't see it through that lens. So it's a great way to at least give them some different experiences.
Great. How about you, Madeline? How do you see SEL really supporting DEI work?
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time digging into this question. So I actually have kind of 5 steps or takeaways that I'm just going to go through. So I'm going to plug my friend and idol, Cornelius Minor, but he says we make curriculum work for kids and not kids work for curriculum. So flexibility that we can provide to make the curriculum work for our kids and not being obsessed with following an exact layout, because this work is very nuanced and we have to be able to modify based on all the different factors and the different, strengths that our kids are bringing into our classroom. I take this research base with just a little tiny bit of a grain of salt and think we just have to think a little bit more deeply about that, because research is very steeped in dominant culture. So I just, encourage us to, again, that both and thinking, how can we continue to pull in stakeholders and community and student voice alongside some of the research and best practices, but not just centering that. To Jason's point, we must talk about what it actually means to decolonize SEL approaches. We must bring parents, families, and communities into the conversation. We must see DEI, equity efforts, and SEL as one and the same. Someone once asked me recently, can you just do an SEL workshop? And I didn't understand the question because I could not, maybe in the beginning of my career, actually not maybe, definitely in the beginning of my career, I didn't connect all the dots so we can support, new teachers or teachers who are new to this work in that. But I could never parse them away from each other. When someone asked me to can you just do a traditional SEL workshop? I didn't know what that meant because I've been engaged in this work so much I couldn't separate the two, and I'd like to help educators get to that point where like, this is my lens, this is what I do. They're not two different lanes. They operate one and the same to support learning and academics, which is my last piece, is that SEL should support learning and academics and should help students achieve whatever their definition of success is, because that's another criticism of SEL, is that we're spending so much time on SEL, kids aren't learning and growing anymore. Like, we always have these things we want to throw darts at and blame for what the real root of the issue is, but we won't go on that tangent. But I think that we really have to be clear about how SEL supports academic and instruction and success for our students.
Thanks. I'm glad I ended with you, Madeline. That was a great wrap up with your points. And I think it wraps in a lot of the questions that we've been diving into in this discussion, really thinking about how, again, it's one and the same, doing this SEL work and really trying to support the DEI work in education as well. I don't think you can separate the two. CASEL's just really come out with thinking about transformative SEL, and the way I think about having true positive impact on all children and youth, you really can't separate the two, particularly with our first question that we talked about and how racism can affect students negatively. So if that's happening, then how do we do all this work to help support them? And another point that I think that I'm hearing from all of you is really thinking about educators and what we have to do for educators to help support not only the SEL work, but our DEI work as well. Because I think it was you, Madeline, that said earlier that it's really an adult issue and problem that instead of, having students trying to figure it out themselves, and we all want to support students' well-being and also their education. So
I hope you found this discussion to be helpful as you start or continue your own journeys. I also want to thank our panelists again for joining me and sharing their expertise. Thank you all for watching.
Thank you to Tia and all of our panelists. Building a world where children, especially those most historically and systemically marginalized, can live and thrive, that is not a vision that can be accomplished alone. It will take collective action and accountability to dismantle systemic racism and foster a culture of belonging. A culture where differences are celebrated instead of feared, and where compassion is the norm, not the exception. If you're not sure where to start, I invite you to visit cfchildren.org/DEI. There you'll find social-emotional learning resources and ideas for how you can help be the change that you hope to see. Take care, everyone. Thank you for joining us today.